Well, contrary to everyone's belief, museums are not important, so you're all excused. It's a long story, and this gets convoluted in different places when I'm talking. And I cover a bunch of different topics, and as they sort of pop into my mind is when I think about them. So we're just going to go, and if I can figure out how to use this again, we'll see if this works this time. I can talk about museums and the impact of museums that's had on me and on the impact that I think it's had on society in general. And I do this by considering what I had done at Intel in a different context, but it's a bridge. It's a bridge that goes from the past to the future, that allows us to understand what happened in the past in order to draw inferences about what might happen in the future and to be able to modify the future to our suiting so we can improve overall civilization. The place that does this, the place that helps, are museums, because without the museums, none of that happens. You can go to the past. One of my favorite remembrances of the movie 2001 Space Odyssey is when the caveman is beating on the ground with a bone and it breaks, it goes up in the air, and it changes it to a spaceship. And that's exactly the thing that I'm more or less talking about. It's how you get from the past of discovery that a bone can be made into a tool, and a tool can be made to a weapon or to a better tool, that all this can turn into eventually to a ship that lands on the moon. To me is wonderful. So when you talk about the bridge, you have a whole bunch of things that are happening, and I'm quite sure that everyone in here that is associated with museum knows about things like crises. Right, Kim? No. Crises and crisis and funding, but on the other side, there are the opportunities into the future. There are educators that help us bring us into the future, and there are bureaucrats that prevent us from going there. There are scientists that go ahead, and there are visionaries that go ahead, and there are politicians that retard it. So it's always a battle of forces of how museums can succeed in the future. And that's part of what I'm talking about here. Now, if we talk about the history of museums, where it started off, you have the Capitoline Museum, Musea Capitolina, a stone's throw from the Colosseum in Rome. It's probably the world's oldest museum. This is according to Wikipedia. Museum dates to 1471, and Pope Sixtus donated many of the important artifacts go to the museum. The Vatican Museum is possibly the second oldest, and it has all the things that date back way, way, way back. It was established in 1506. In the United States, the Philadelphia Museum was the first serious museum in 1743. Predated the Smithsonian, predated Harvard, predated the British Museum. All that happened. But I actually have a different view. If you go back to the definition at the bottom of the museum, Greek form museum, meaning the seat of the muses, I believe that the Great Library of Alexandria is really the first of the museums, because it's the first place that started accumulating objects that led to education, research, understanding for the future. So I'd put the Great Library of Alexandria as 1,500 years before the first acknowledged museum, the Capitoline.
What kind of objects did they have there?
Now, going back to the past, there's a whole bunch of things that we find out when we go into the past. We see dinosaur bones, we see volcanoes erupting, we see oceans that formed, we find ore bodies that people exploit, we see quartz crystals that people dig up, all kinds of neat stuff. And I remember when I first went into a museum, my question is, how did this happen? Where did this come from? Why is this happening? And that's what we mean by understanding the past so that we can improve the future. Because my work, for example, was in improving the future through technology, through the computer chips and all that sort of thing. It's a study of crystals that led to the understanding of semiconductors and how to better make semiconductors. New medicines that come from ancient superstitions from the jungles of Brazil, the origin of the universe from people that look at through a telescope and taking a picture, and then coming back and looking at that picture 20 years later and saying, what changed and why did it change? Overall, the quality of life improves because of the impact of museums on human life. My personal trip started at the age of 11 when I met a gentleman named Gunnar Henningsmoen, who was the curator of the Oslo, Norway Geology and Paleontology Museum, who was a friend of my uncle. Gunnar and my uncle Sigmund had met when they were 8 or 9 years old, and if anyone knows about Norway, they know outside of Oslo is a place called Bygda, and Bygda is a little peninsula that has a lot of things in it, including trilobites. And my uncle Sigmund was with Gunnar Henningsmoen, who became a world expert on trilobites, when he first dug up a trilobite on that little place of Bygda in near Oslo. That meeting in 1949 led directly to me becoming a material scientist, because I always was asking why, where, from what happened, how did all this come about? And that led to me getting, directly, it's not as if this is, well, there's a distant connection. It's a real serious one-by-one step that led me to get a doctor's degree in material science, because for my first time, Gunnar showed me a quartz crystal. I wondered how it got those 6 sides, and I wondered why it would break the way it did, but a piece of halite would break the way it did. Totally different ways of breaking these things apart, fracture and cleavage. It led me to whatever success I've had in the semiconductor industry in the past year of the board of 2 exciting museums. One museum here in Arizona, the Alfie Norville Museum, the other the Rice Museum. The Rice Museum is now under the guidance of 2 people sitting here. Kim, who's the executive director, and Gail, who is the head chairperson of the board. And the Alfie Norville Museum, which turned into an immense success far beyond our wildest expectations when we were setting it up.
Gene, the director of the Alfie Norville Museum, is sitting right next to Kim. All right.
That is correct. Thank you. Violetta, there's a new, how long, you've been here about a year now? The head of the Alfie Norville Museum. I always think of it in terms of when I was working with Paul Harder and Joaquin. This is where my history really goes on that. I'm trying to talk about the things that related directly to my history of how I got here, which is why I did not personally snub you, Violet. But I want to point out one thing, which is my story is, whatever I've done, it's not unique. Natural history museums affected almost everybody in the hobby. They started young, they went to museums, they met people that were of influence, these people inspired them, and they went on to do whatever they did, either in the field of geology or oceanography or astronomy or mineralogy or whatever, as well as other things. Take a Steve Smale, who's a brilliant mathematician, just a huge number of people that have started this way by going to the quarries and the road cuts and the museums when they were 8, 9, 10 years old. So when did you start, Carl? How old were you?
I started collecting minerals when I was in 2nd grade.
2nd grade, same time, yeah. 8 years old, 9 years old, right? This is a typical kind of story. My beginnings began with my uncle Sigmund. As I said, this is me, the little person there in 1941, just at the beginning of World War II, and my uncle, who had escaped from Norway. My father was from near Kongsberg, which is why I have a fascination with Kongsberg silver. He immigrated to the United States in 1930. but the rest of his family remained behind. One uncle escaped the Holocaust, and that was my Uncle Sigmund, who got to the United States, got to Canada, went to the Royal Norwegian Air Force in exile in Canada, which is where this picture was taken. He was shot down over England, over Holland during the war, but survived and came to Cleveland and lived with me. So he's the one that, first of all, got me interested in technology because he was more interested in technology. And it was his friend, Gunnar Henningsmoen, that he gave me the introduction to in Norway. So it's between Sigmund Meieran and Gunnar Henningsmoen that I had these direct starts into collecting. This is Gunnar Henningsmoen taken after the war. Just an interesting tidbit, just for the heck of it. There was a very, very famous scientist at the Oslo Museum named Victor Goldschmidt. I guess what would geographer, not a geographer.
Geochemist.
I guess geochemist would be, yeah. He was captured by the Nazis. He was Jewish. He was captured by the Nazis in Norway, and he was sent to the boat, taking them to Auschwitz, along with my grandparents. And the Jewish, not the Jewish community, the scientific community in Oslo petitioned the Nazi government to let him free. He was freed from the boat. Otherwise, he would have been off to Auschwitz on the Donau, same time as my family went. And there's some nice pictures of Gunnar with Victor Goldschmidt. Anyway, I went to the Oslo Museum, and the first thing I remember seeing there is you walk in and you see this Tyrannosaurus Rex head. And this is 49, 50, 20, 80 years ago, whatever. And I still remember walking in there and saying, wow. And that's the thing that starts you off in museums is, wow, how is that possible? Went back to Cleveland, and there was a guy named Ed Delfs at the Cleveland Museum and head of the natural history part. He was sort of a collector of crystals. And he got me interested more by allowing me to go and look at the specimens at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Then I went on to Purdue University, and there was another person there, Richard Lonsbury, who was the head of mineralogy, who at one time I hated because he gave a mineral identification test of, they pass around 18 specimens and say, what are they? And these were 18 different varieties of willemite. Well, I guess this is willemite. This one must be something else. No, they were all willemite, different shapes, colors, and everything. Nobody got it right. Anyway, this was, then I went on to MIT, and of course, being near Harvard, I spent time at Harvard University at the Mineral Museum there and met Cliff Rondell and all the other people. And one of my first exchanges of minerals was from the fact that I had found a fairly rare mineral when I was at Purdue in the quarries of Indiana, and I traded it to Cliff Rondell for a bunch of Franklin minerals. And I still remember he being excited by having these little tiny flakes of smithite, and me getting things like, I don't know, Hodgkinsonite and all those wonderful things. But again, it just inspired me to continue. During that time at MIT, I had time to go down to Washington and see the Smithsonian, met Paul Desautel. And again, you have these wow moments. The first time I walked in there and you see this creature, you say, wow, how is that possible? Again, it inspires you to say, how did this come about? And of course, they have the wonderful gem collection and mineral collection, the Smithsonian. Does anyone know the history of this big amethyst at Smithsonian?
I know that we have the pocket made to that.
Yeah. You know when it dates from?
I think it's from 1961.
Precisely. I was there in 1961, and I had been to, from Boston, my wife and I had taken a trip to Provincetown in Rhode Island, way at the tip, and Provincetown, Massachusetts, at the very tip. And I had found a rock there that was labeled tourmaline, and I knew it wasn't tourmaline, but I didn't know what it was. And so about a year later, this is 1960 or so, a year later, I was down at the Smithsonian and I met with Paul Distells and I showed him the thing. It turned out to be a scapolite from New York, a really nice, big scapolite, which he liked. And he said, Gene, I want to show you something. And he pulled out the box. This is when he first opened the box with this amethyst in it. And he said, now, what do I do with that? Because he said they had to do something about the appraisal and the insurance and whatever it was. And he says, how do I figure out what that's worth? Because the only one we have now is like this. And there's this monster that they had. And so again, Paul was kind enough to take a young college student and just talk to him. Of course, my awe of Howard continued throughout the years. The faculty, Cliff Rondell, Carl Herbert, I met at the time, Alden Carpenter. We used to go out collecting together, and much later, I didn't meet him there, but I met him subsequently, which is Harrison Schmitt, which is the Apollo 17 astronaut geologist. And of course, the Harvard Museum is awe-inspiring because of its diversity, the quality of the specimens, the size of the collection, and the information base that goes along with it that says we know what these things are, we know where they came from, we know when they were found, we know what they're made of, we know what they look like, and so forth and so on. And this created for me the time that I changed from a person who was accumulating everything that was not nailed down to becoming a collector, and particularly a scientific collection. And I put together a collection of about 1,200 different species. Specimens were worth about maybe 70 cents then, and they're probably worth 72 cents now. True appraisal, I mean, that's how valuable it is. But, they were kind of oddball sort of things. And then, of course, you just have to be inspired by the Harvard specimens. One time I was putting together, later on at the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show, I put out a display of what's called face-centered cubic native elements, which includes gold, silver, copper, platinum, a few other things, even diamond and some other things. And I was led the Harvard Gold, which happened to be at Houston at the time, and Joel Barge brought it over, and I was holding it in one hand to put it in the case. And Mike Scott, who was in another part of the story, I was at his house and he let me take the diamond, his cubic diamond, which is about 1.5 inches across. And I remember walking across the inside the exhibition hall with the diamond in one hand and the gold in the other hand, saying, "Boy, I hope I don't drop these." Long time ago. That led to my professional career, which was at Fairchild and Intel, study of crystals, why they do what they do, and what they should and what they can do for the future. The result of given my first Kongsberg silver by Gunnar Henningsmoen back in 1949, which I still have, and that one was worth $1 then, and is worth about $1.20 now. So it's really appreciated. Self-collecting fossils, Petoskey stones in Michigan, all of which generated a sense of wonder, which is the thing that everybody needs in order to go and do what we're doing here. Led to me the study of defects in crystals by X-ray diffraction, electron microscopy, and understanding of why they do these things. Developed the technology for the computer industry, which means you can either love me for being part of the cell phone revolution, or you can hate me for being part of the cell phone revolution. It's both the same. And I continued throughout the time, from 9 years old until now, the interest in specimen collection. But then I became involved in the museum shows and education. In terms of Fairchild, that's the silicon crystal size when I first started at Fairchild, 1963. And at the top right, you can see a transistor that was made by, this is a germanium transistor, but it's, about the same time frame. And the industry grew, so this is now the current silicon. Single crystal silicon, almost zero defects. and it makes these kinds of devices with over 1 billion transistors inside this little teeny tiny chip. And you just wonder, how did this all happen? And actually, I can follow exactly how it happened because I know how it happened. It was part of this growth of this industry. Then became involved in, I beg your pardon? The Rice Northwest Museum of Rocks and Minerals in Hillsboro, which is an old family home, a collector that used to get a lot of material down here and decided in the late 90s to convert it into a museum. And they made a very, very wonderful museum, which I was board on. Now Gail is the chairperson of the board of the Rice Museum. And it's interesting when I think back, because I was involved with this great Alma Rose rhodochrosite, because I was part of the team with Brian Lees to go dig up the rhodochrosites from Alma. And he dug this up in the Alma King and the other ones. And I remember the day before they became available to people to go to the museums, he put them out on his table. My wife and I were up there. My wife just put her elbows down on the table and stared at these two remarkable rocks, the King, Alma King, and this one. I could have bought them and, not be here. I could have been in, owned a building in Bahrain or something like that. But the specimen finally got to, I had a little bit of control with it when I was at the Rice Museum, but the beautiful, beautiful specimen. And then I was involved with the Flandreau Museum here in Tucson. You can see some of the things Rob Levinsky put in, some wonderful exhibits. And then we had an opportunity when Alan Norville became involved to make the great Alfie Norville Gem and Mineral Museum in Tucson, which has things on loan like these enormous silver specimens that were dug up. This is what I mean where you can see history. Here are things that were actually fairly modern, but they are representative of the whole area around globe of the silver mining. And then, of course, they attracted other kinds of things like the collection of Ed David, which is at the museum. So it's just a wonderful way that museums prosper. But it's my belief only if we understand the past can we go to the future. And it takes museums, which are repositories of artifacts, that's what they are, which become home and learning centers for curious and inquisitive people. That's why the museums do what they do. They preserve history to show us what was in order to help us find out what can be. And the whole thing, Steve Jobs with the miracle of the cell phone comes from, he was a collector also. See, so was the chairman, not the chairman of the board, the senior vice president of Microsoft was Bob Steve. They were all collectors, and they all started again the same way as I started. They were a little more successful than I was, but provides the training grounds for future scientists, engineers, doctors, and educators, and people in this room are living examples of exactly that. Museums are about us, who we were, and where we are, and where we're going, and therefore I have to go and talk back about the dedicated people that caused this to happen. Of course, Gunnar Henningsmoen for me, Dick Lonsbury at Purdue, Cliff Frondell at first at Harvard, and then gentleman sitting here, Carl Francis, which we've had an enormous number of conversations about different things at Harvard. Paul Desautel, who took me in at the Smithsonian, a nobody, a total nobody, and he took time to come in and show me this wonderful amethyst that had just arrived. John White, Joel Barch, who I've become working with. George Robinson was very influential with me at the Seaman Museum. Another gentleman, Bob Dellens, which has tremendous impact on who I am and how I've done things, because he is a scientist, and we talk science as well as talking rocks and crystals and minerals. And of course, the greatest private, I don't know, it's not private museum, but the greatest building to the greatest museum in the world outside of the normal museum, which is the MIM in Beirut, Lebanon. which is unfortunate that not enough people can go to visit this enormous, wonderful museum. So I believe the museums are resources for the collection of artifacts, for doing research, for understanding history, for discovery. The whole business of dinosaurs when they were first found and how they turned into, or the discovery of the Pleistocene man, or of the, what's the one in England that was a fake? The Piltdown, yeah, the Piltdown, which turned out to be a fake after somebody started investigating it. And every now and then you read in the paper that this painting was found to be underneath. So you found a new painting, and then you found out that a painting that you thought was old was actually new. So it works in both directions. But they provide the grounds for education and inspiration. I think they're essential. These are museum specimens now. Luckily and these are ones I actually had a hand in at one time or another. The big pigmentite on the upper left I gave to the Norville Museum, the morganite to Seaman. I did not give the Smithsonian these two topazes, but I was responsible for their going to the Smithsonian because I saved them from destruction in 1960. They were going to be cut up into X-ray monochrome binders. And I told the person who owned them, I said, Phil, I will kill you if you cut these up. And got them to the Smithsonian. The MIM, the Big Aqua, the Harvard has the Fleur de Lis Jonas machine, and the Rice Museum has a number of specimens. But there's still more to it. Museums have all the other history-making objects. They have the Rosetta Stone, the Wright brothers' first airplane, the original computers, mechanical and electrical computers, the first printed books that actually allowed dissemination of information, the first, I don't even know how to describe it. It's a computer, but it was, 2,000 years old. What do they call the Amiatrix, found in the Mediterranean in an old ship, and it's got all these beautiful brass gears and everything that was put together. Some people believe it was an invention by Aristotle. It was dug up, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, and they started doing X-ray pictures of it. And it was used for predicting the eclipses of the sun and the moon and the stars and all that. And it's just a genius of a piece of equipment, 2,000 years old. Invention of X-rays with Röntgen. The Dead Sea Scrolls. The ones on the bottom right are the little mosaics that were found on the top of Masada from 2,000 years ago when the Romans invaded then Palestine and were invading. A few Jews went up to the top of a mountain called Masada, and they then killed themselves rather than be subjugated by the Romans. And Josephus wrote about this 2,000 years ago when they did the excavation. They found the very tiles that were used to select the people that were going to do the killing of the others so that they wouldn't become captive. Bottom middle is the first photograph taken. About the bottom left is the 10,000 terracotta statues in China. The first spacecraft to come back from the moon. This is the Apollo 11 spacecraft. The two big topazes, the first electric light bulbs. Other kinds of things that you can see in the bottom. The telescope is, of course, the one that Galileo used to observe Jupiter. So it was quite something. And then you have all kinds of other artifacts in there. One of my favorite is, of course, the fact that you can see the Viking ships, which is brings me back to Norway, the first cameras. Beautiful, beautiful specimens that were dug out not too long ago, 450 years ago, from the Tourmaline Queen mine. Who knows what that thing is on the bottom left? That's correct. It's what you carry around in your pocket now. Then, of course, you come to the specimens themselves that are at the museums. A lot of names. And the thing is that you could name something, and all of a sudden brings to you the inspiration that went behind it. The Hooker Emerald, the Aztec sun, the Grandite, the Gold Dragon, found by Brian Lees, who's hey, Brian, is that you? Yeah, Brian Lees dug up that one. The Hope Diamond, the big tourmaline from the Jonas mine, the Taruga, the Horn from Harvard, the Alma King. The names just inspire you to say, "Wow, those are true artifacts, like the Winged Victory of, or the Venus de Milo, or the whatever." Wonderful things. But there's also things that are still can be coming out. They still come out. And this may be a surprise to some people. There's one that just going to come out at the Yale Peabody Museum. Finally, people will get to see the very, very famous Jonas rocket. Been buried for the last 50 years. And all of a sudden, it is now going to come out. It's been loaned to the Yale Museum. And when they finish doing their redecoration and everything, you'll finally be able to see this enormously famous Jonas tourmaline. Imagine going into, I just imagine, it was a little hole that they dug in, and they put a flashlight, and they see this enormous cavern of stuff, and they started, just imagine finding a tourmaline crystal, bright red, that's as tall as you are. It's just magic. What does the future hold? It's undetermined. There's certainly going to be digital everything. Here's this artifact, you can now project it into somebody's house in 3 dimensions, and they can get to see it. They can maybe be able to hear the sound of Al Jolson singing, and I see an image of him singing and all that. So people are going to get to see and hear things that more people are going to get to see and hear things than ever before. But on the other hand, fewer people are going to experience these things, of actually seeing the real thing, I remember when I went to Italy and I saw Galileo's telescope, I just remember looking at him and saying, this is the telescope that changed astronomy. It's not, here's an image of the telescope. Here is the real, honest-to-God telescope with his fingerprints still on it, for all I know, of the person who changed forever history. We've seen the rise of many specialized museums. The Indigenous Peoples Museum are sprouting up. Music museums. There's one in Phoenix, which is, I just think, one of the great museums of the world, is the Music Museum, the Spy Museums, the Food Museums, the Stamp Museums, the Coin Museums. If people have an idea, they create a museum because they are preserving the history. Less discovery, because you need to see things and feel things and touch things and experiment with things in order to learn. And just seeing them, even if you see them in 3 dimensions and they're there, they look real, is not the same as experiencing them. And I think it will also lead to fewer mentors, such as the Gunnar Henningsmoen or Cliff Rindell kind of people. Did you work with Cliff? I mean, it's just working with these kind of people that makes you who you are. We're going to have a more informed citizenry as a result of this, but I think they're going to be less knowing. They will say, what is this? They'll take out their Apple iPhone and they'll press a button and it'll say, this was discovered in 1636 by blah, blah, and they'll read it and they'll immediately forget it, which is different from what they would have done had they gone on there and they said, boy, I'm touching the thing that Galileo used to discover the moons of Jupiter. So it's a less knowing society, but there'll be more people that know less, so maybe the total amount of knowledge will be the same. But most important to the museum's success are the objects, the staff, and the visitors. Emphasis on visitors. And therefore, Violetta, here's your slide. Do your part. Visit the Alfie Norville Gem and Mineral Museum right here in Tucson. That's it. I'm open for questions. Brian?
You mentioned that people are not going to be as interested, or they're not going to have the opportunity to see the object.
I'm sorry, speak up.
I'm going to stand up.
Don't hit the ceiling.
Less opportunity, as museums grow, to see the objects. They're putting objects away and they're creating new experiences. And this is in conflict with seeing the actual object. But with budgets and everything, museums are crimped, and they're doing these scoping studies to see what the people in their environment seem to want to do. And I'm not going to name the museum, but there's one museum I was talking to that did a local survey and found out that people wanted to have an experience. They wanted to touch objects. So they weren't really interested in going in and seeing a systematic collection like we would see in a lot of museums. Or the Harvard, we could see systematic. Many museums used to have that. A lot of those collections are getting put away in favor of this new experiential thing. And I don't think it's a good trend personally, because you want to go see the object, you want to see that telescope, you want to go see the Harvard wire. And it's a big issue, I think, with museums. And I think it cuts across a lot of lines. Some people are like, we're going to do this, we're going to put the stuff away, and other museums are sort of bucking this trend. And I think the ones that buck it are going to be more successful. Right, personal.
Brian, if I might follow up, something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it has to do with this experiential learning versus going and trying to learn something at a museum. Yes, you can learn something at a museum. You're not gonna become a master of a subject at a museum. It's not the right place to do that. You do it at home, you do it in the classroom, whatever. I think of all of the things that Gene listed on his slide about the significance of collection is the inspiration.
Yeah.
And seeing that object is the most inspiring thing. And it's, being somebody in a museum and listening to the oohs and ahs and wows. Then you go home and you learn about it. You're inspired to learn about it, and you have the drive to do that. I think that's the most important thing that we do in the museums and here, seeing that beautiful specimen and becoming inspired. And not going and thinking, okay, this is a substitute for a textbook.
Well, I remember, again, going back to this Norwegian museum, taking a halite, a reasonable halite crystal, hit it with a hammer, and you get little halite crystals, which is kind of neat. And I remember going back home and I'm saying, how come that didn't happen when I hit my quartz crystal with a hammer? How come I didn't get a little teeny tiny quartz? Well, I did get, but they didn't have any faces on them. And I just wondered, what is it about halite that makes it different from silicon dioxide? What property? What is it? There's got to be something in there, and that's what this is. The inspiration of actually doing it, seeing it. I didn't learn what it was from the Oslo Museum. But I learned to question why it was there. Oh, you had a Gail?
When I was a docent at the Pearl Museum for 9 years, in the General Hall, it's really interesting. The museum's kind of lost out on something important, which was the transition from finding it in the ground to how it gets to the museum. They have no understanding of how that beautiful crystal came out of the ground. When you tell them it can come up from the side of the mountain, they're completely blown away because they think it's always way down the ground. But museums are going to need to think more about the questions that are asked by people. And a lot of times it's, where did this come from? What did it look like? Where did it grow? Was it a giant cavern or was it in a field? And these are things that I think can entice people back into museums if we can answer the questions that they seem to ask all the volunteers.
At the Nordholm Museum, we tried to put these little video things there with, when I envisioned that, it was so you could see images of the pockets or the collectors, and that was the purpose of those. And
Yeah.
there are a few of them that are showing that, like the tourmalines coming out of Maine that are just, they got a hose there and they're just blowing up. You just go, whoa. As an experienced collector, it blows your mind away.
It brings out the very treasure island.
Yeah.
portion of all of our brains, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So there's ways to do that. One of the things that are
Yeah.
doing the video for the technology.
No?
One of the successes of the main Metal and Gem Museum is the Meteorite Gallery. And the Meteorite Gallery is the product of just the passion of our founder. And he is absolutely flabbergasted by Mars and Moon and has bought up as much of those meteorites as he can. And so the people who come to our museum, the last experience they have is the opportunity to hold a piece of the Moon and Mars and have a selfie taken. And Larry wants every visitor to have that experience. Somebody was coming out of the museum late in the afternoon and they hadn't had that. And he took them right back in and right back up to the Meteorite Gallery and gave it to him. He really cares about that, and it's inspiring the people. So it comes back to that sense of wonder.
Yeah, to go along with the meteorite question, it always bugged me when I would see a palisite meteorite. I would look at a palisite, which is, an iron nickel core, studded with little idocrase crystals. Where are Vesuvianite, olivine crystals. And I look at them and say, that ain't possible. You cannot get these olivine crystals inside of a molten, it's not possible. It turns out that, again, people that were questioning this found out that it comes from a particular part of an asteroid that has to be between this part, that part, and a certain thing. That's why they're so rare, is because they don't represent the body of the asteroid. They just represent sort of a thin skin or something like that. But I'm still truly irritated that those things happen. So the sense of inquiry never disappears.
I do volunteer work at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and the Geology, Gems and Mineral Hall. And to your point about the meteorites, there's an exhibit there where people can stick their hand in a lucite box and touch a slice of a Martian meteorite. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people do it. And a lot of people walk by it. And whenever I say, "Hey, but did you get a chance to touch that Martian meteorite?" Everybody, from the kids to the adults, they're glad they did, even though they're really touching the oil and thousands of other people. But it's like everyone thanks me and they're glad I pointed it out.
Yeah, but going even to that point again, the source of inquiry, I said, there are lots of meteorites that land on the Earth. How do you know it's from Mars? How do you know it's from the Moon? I said, I don't believe you.
Great scientific.
I said, I don't believe you could do that. And then I delve into it, and then they say, well, you do this and this and this and this and this, and then you do that test and do this radiation, and you do that kind of a thing, and you look at the isotope like this, that, and of course it's from Mars. All right, I accept that.
We get that question a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, I do believe in museums. That's why I do what I do.
Yeah.